Hey y'all, it's Auntie Sug from the Clinical Cookout. Let's talk about our series this week called Not My Kid. First of all, I want to address bullying. A lot of people say, not my kid would never. My kids are taught not to bully, my kids are taught this, my kids are taught to be nice to everybody. Let's get into that, because not only is your kid probably a bully if somebody is saying that they've been victimized by your kid, but we also have to look at ourselves and wonder, let's talk about why, or let's talk about what this causes, or how do I talk to my kid about that? Let's get into it. First of all, a study by Trent Dooley in 2019 stated that kids who come from more poor socioeconomic backgrounds have difficulty with bullying. Why? Because I grew up in these neighborhoods, right? Kids in the hood, they pick on each other, and they don't mean to be malicious. They don't mean to be mean. It's sometimes a coping mechanism for some kids, and sometimes you have to protect yourself. It could be protective measures. But studies show that peer victimization is one of the bigger causes of suicide, and peer victimization does rear its ugly head in the form of bullying. Now, what population, you ask? The population is probably indigenous people, which is Native Americans or American Indian, depending on where you come from, how you say it, or African Americans, or just people of color, because a lot of people of color in the United States have difficult socioeconomic backgrounds. And this is not to say that bullying does not come from white people before anybody says anything, because that is not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that there's increased risk with ethnicity. One of the reasons why there's increased risk with ethnicity is because of gender identity. In the Black culture, I'm going to go ahead and say this, it's not necessarily looked at as a positive or as okay to be anything but heterosexual. So people who are not heterosexual tend to be victimized, and not necessarily by only their peers. Sometimes it could be by parents. Sometimes that victimization comes in the form of religious bullying. You will not be gay because God said that it's not okay. Or bullying from siblings. You know, you're soft, you're a punk. I should have beat you up a long time ago, and maybe you wouldn't be the way that you are. Or from peers, look at him. He likes to look like a girl, he likes to dress like a girl, or she's a man, or she likes to look like a man. So peer victimization based on gender identity in certain neighborhoods can definitely be a big stressor. Another problem that comes up with bullying is weight. There are multiple people just walking around who have a problem with bigger people. If you look at Lizzo, people have a problem with Lizzo when Lizzo doesn't have a problem with herself. People have a problem with obese people when they don't even have a problem with themselves. And that's because in society it's not necessarily a positive to be obese. Now we're going to say, okay, there's a lot of health risks, and there are, but it does not mean that people need to be bullied for their size or for things that they can't help right now. There's a lot of other factors that come into play, like diabetes or genetics. And you know what I mean? Most teenagers are not thinking about working out. Most teenagers are losing weight naturally or are just naturally thin. But when they're not, teenagers and other kids are being picked on at school for it. The study by Trent also showed that the majority of people who were bullied were female, and they were of racial and ethnic descent. Just for weight, height, bias, stigma, discrimination, overweight female middle school kids living in North Dakota were bullied the most. The study by Trent also showed that in North Dakota, surprise, surprise, female ethnic students were bullied more. And it's because of racial discrimination, bias, and stigma. And they actually have lived experiences of these. And a lot of the students felt like they were suicidal at one point in time. This means, yes, in some states, minorities have higher suicidality than white people. But we always say, you know, not us, not Black people. Yes, we experience racial discrimination and bias, and just it's difficult to deal with, especially middle school, because middle school kids are the most insecure kids that are trying to find themselves, and they are quicker to gravitate towards the mob mentality, where there's a bunch of students on one student just so that you don't feel left out, or you're glad that it's happening to somebody else instead of you. I said all of that to say schools have high levels of victimization, but also poor economic neighborhoods have high levels of victimization, and also Black people have high levels of victimization. So it's not always a white problem. It can be an African American problem. And the reason why I highlight African Americans is because I am an African American and I do come from those poor socioeconomic backgrounds. So when you think, not my kid was not taught to act like that. My kid would never do anything like that. It could very well be your kid. And if it is your kid, you need to be talking to your kids about how not to victimize somebody. Or guess what? Their parents did not raise them to be like that. So make sure that they're not going to school and perpetuating these stigmas and these cycles and hurting other people. But you know what? One thing we do need to think about is hurt people hurt people. So we do need to sit down, look back, and maybe kind of reevaluate and see where they may have got this behavior from. And it might not be you, but if it's coming from somewhere, it's your job to get to the source of it.